Chapter 44, A Change of Nature. A Change of Nature. The room was tranquil, the only sounds, the breathing of those asleep around him and the birdsong drifting in from the street outside as a warm yellow light poured in through the open curtains. Anomen lay still, watching the gentle rise and fall of her form as Frithia slept next to him. Her hair had escaped the blankets in the night and spilled out across the floor, bright against the dark wooden boards. He focused on the nearest curl, wavy until an inch or so from the end where it spiraled into a perfect ringlet, and he looked at it for what seemed like hours until she sighed, shifting in her sleep to pull it out of reach. She was laid upon her back now and he could see the tension in her face as she slept, her lips moving silently. His friends had collared him when he had returned to the order with an Arg's cup, asked him if he had heard the latest developments. Rumor had it that those who had saved the gate had had one of the children with them. Was it the druid? Or the Rashami? Or that odd fellow with the blue hair? And though Anomen had said nothing at the time, he had suddenly known without a doubt who it was. Frithia groaned quietly, her hand tightening on her blankets. He had been trying to get her alone to ask her about it those last few days, but it was when he was sat with her, watching the girl blithely preparing the chestnuts for Aries' birthday, that he had finally decided it didn't really matter. He had never seen anything but goodness in her before, and whoever her father had been was really none of his concern. And yet, his curiosity lingered still, not from any worry as to her virtue, but stemming from a hope that she shared with him the same inner turmoil, a constant struggle against a hatred bred in bone that went against the desires of heart and mind. Frithia gasped suddenly, starting awake, for a moment disorientated before she seemed to remember herself, turning with a sigh and finally noticing him. She colored slightly, adding to the disheveled clothes and unkempt hair to give the meeting a strangely intimate air. Anomen swallowed and finally broke the silence.
A nightmare?
She nodded, but said nothing, the silence between them prompting him to break it again. He knew he had decided it did not matter, but...
My lady!
A glance revised things.
Frithia,
he continued, and she closed her eyes, sighing as she turned under the blankets to settle on her stomach, laying her head back down to pillow on her arms and fix him with a dark unblinking eye.
Yes, Anomen. There is something I have been wanting to ask you about for a while now, if you would permit me. In the gate, I was told, well, you said that things ended when you killed a man, Saravik, the one who had managed to instigate the war between our two lands, and I heard, have heard since that he was your brother.
Anomen watched her carefully for any sign of reaction to his words, but Frithia just stared back, the silence broken only by the steady breathing of the others around them, until finally she blinked slowly and answered.
I never considered him to be any relation of mine.
Silence once more. The clear brown eye was making him feel uncomfortable, and Anomen was about to sit up and find his flask just to break the tension when she spoke again.
But I suppose if you wish to look at it technically, he was my half-brother, we shared the same father. That was what you were getting at, wasn't it, Anomen?
She continued, a slight terseness creeping into her voice.
His father was Baal and so was mine. Why are you asking me questions you already have the answers to?
Anomen turned away, embarrassed and now wishing he had kept to his decision not to mention it, as he shifted onto his back to stare up at the whitewashed ceiling.
I am sorry,
he mumbled, unsure of what else to say.
How long have you known?
He heard her sigh and shift as well.
About 4 or so months now. People are always quite surprised, they can't believe it was such a shock to me, that I must have had some inkling, some dark premonition, but...
She trailed off, nothing more to say.
It must have been a most terrible thing to discover.
he heard her shrug.
Perhaps, but it is not a burden I bear alone.
He thought for a moment she was referring to her friends, until she continued,
there are hundreds of others he spawned, perhaps even thousands, so I'm hardly special. Though I suppose I have a little more background knowledge than most, for all the good it does. Background knowledge?
Anomen repeated, glancing to her.
Yes, my education in Candlekeep just happened to include the God's War and predictions surrounding it, though it meant little to me at the time. The prophecy of the Ballspawn, the prophecy of Aelando the Wise. All very well and good, but as with many of our Alan's far-sighted glimpses, it tells only of what will occur and not even a hint of what to do about it.
Frithia smiled humorlessly, the gesture soon becoming a wince as she rubbed her forehead with a frown.
My head is aching. It was probably the sherry,
he supplied, though he doubted it, quietly passing her his flask and sitting up to root in his bag a moment, withdrawing a small packet of prepared herbs.
Here, take those as well, my lady, they should help.
She nodded her thanks, sitting to empty the packet straight onto her tongue and washing it down with a mouthful of water before settling back down again with a sigh.
Ah, wake me in the spring.
But unfortunately, it was but a few hours later when Frithia was woken, the landlord arriving to inform them 2 more rooms had become vacant that morning, the men taking one while Nalia and Jahara had left for the other. Ari had been rather reluctant to leave her bed that morning, and allowing the group to prepare for the day with relative ease. Anomen locked his door and set off along the hall, Herr Dallas and Minsk already in the tavern below taking breakfast. He felt better for having washed and changed his clothes, a feeling only improved when he thought back to that morning and his talk with Frithia. Though not the easiest of subjects to broach initially, now it had been brought up, he felt certain the worst was over with, and it was as though a weight had been lifted from him. If someone with the blood of a dark god could control their baser impulses to maintain a good and honorable path, then he was confident such a thing was not without his grasp either. But better though he felt, he was worried too that it had not been a discussion that Frithia had been particularly comfortable with, a worry which had only grown when the girl had been awoken the second time, her manner with him civil but unmistakably strained. Anomen paused in the corridor outside the room they had all shared the night before, and now housing only Frithia and Ari. Though he would likely see the girl soon enough, he could not help but want to speak with her in private one last time and gain some reassurance that their friendship had not been a casualty of his curiosity. Anomen knocked, a familiar voice calling "Come in," and he opened the door to find the pair up and changed. Frithia sat at the dresser going through the last of the spoils they had taken from the bandits but days before, seemingly sorting out which would be best sold there and which would likely fetch a better price back in Athkatla. Meanwhile Ari was amusing herself by trying on the various pieces of jewellery they had found in amongst the loot. The girl currently stood before the room's mirror wearing a heavy gold necklace set with stones that matched her eyes.
"Hello Anomen,"
Frithia greeted, not even looking up from the ring she was studying, and he felt his previous worries surge.
"What can we do for you?" "Ah, well, I was passing your room and I merely wanted to see whether you and Ari wished to accompany me downstairs to breakfast."
Frithia set down the ring and picked up another, again without sparing him a glance, though he could see her smiling and his fears abated slightly.
"Oh, an escort, it really is your birthday, Ari,"
the girl laughed, gesturing absently to the bed behind her.
"Take a seat, Anomen, we'll just be a moment."
He accepted her offer, spending the next few moments watching Ari twirl before the glass, observing herself from every angle before resignedly handing the necklace back to Frithia and returning to her packing. There was a time before when he would have dismissed such behavior as improvident vanity, but Anomen had come to appreciate lately the small pleasures that traveling with fair young women could afford, and watching Ari preen for a moment or two, the necklace shimmering against the milk white of her throat had been a pleasant diversion. The squire smiled to himself, how Simon would laugh if he knew.
Right, well, I am finished,
announced Ari after a moment, pointedly shouldering her bag.
Shall I just see you both down there?
And before Anomen had even a chance to reply, she had bid them both farewell and disappeared.
Keen, isn't she?
Smiled Fritha.
Herr Dallas hasn't given her his present yet,
she added with a laugh as though that explained it. Anomen smiled as well, watching her as she examined a long thin dagger, the necklace now laid carelessly before her.
You do not find it hard to part with such objects?
Fritha questioned, at last glancing up from her work to notice the necklace, and realization dawned.
Oh, not particularly. I mean, it looks very nice on Ari, the colors attend her well. Attend her?
He cut in, intrigued by her odd phrasing, but Fritha just continued without comment.
But I don't really have any use for such ornaments, unfortunately,
she added with a grin.
So you own no jewelry then?
He pressed, interested even if only by the rarity of the thing. Even the poorest of girls usually had some mean ring or pendant with which to adorn themselves. Fritha just shrugged though, seemingly unconcerned.
No. Well, not really. My lady. Well, I do have one piece.
She continued slowly, giving him an appraising sort of look before leaning in with conspiratorial smile and drawing up a long brown cord from beneath her tunic. Anomen waited with bated breath, unsure of what to expect, and he could barely contain his disappointment when she finally revealed a smooth flat lump of uncarved green stone.
It's jade,
she said in answer to his look, dropping it lightly into his hand.
A belated birthday gift from Imoen a year or so before we left Candle Keep.
It was warm where it had lain next to her skin, and as he looked closer, he noticed the many shades of green that swirled in veins to make up the whole.
It is beautiful,
he said finally, and meant it too, unsure as to how he had not noticed it from the start. Fritha smiled, taking the stone back to slip under her tunic and returning to her work. Anomen frowned, reluctantly recalling the real reason for his visit.
Fritha, I hope I did not upset you before, when we spoke of.
He swallowed, unsure of how to phrase it, and in the end he gave up.
Well. I merely wish to apologize if I made you feel uncomfortable. I can sometimes act thoughtlessly, though it is never my intention.
Fritha sighed, leaning back in her chair to send him a tired smile.
Ah, and now we get to the reason for this morning's unexpected offers of gallantry.
She shook her head, turning back to the dresser before her.
Don't fret, Anomen. Your curiosity is understandable, and, besides, I came to terms with my ancestry long ago. Came to terms with it?
He repeated, trying to keep the surprise he felt from his voice.
Then, you do not mind being descended from such dark powers?
Fritha snorted.
Well, I'll hold off singing about it for the moment, but I'm certainly not ashamed. Why onto should I be? I haven't done anything wrong.
Anomen nodded slowly.
Yes, but... Well, such a heritage surely means more than just who your father was. Saravik. Was Saravik and I am me,
Fritha cut in evenly.
Just as within normal families, being related doesn't mean you are in any way predisposed to certain characteristics.
She paused, sending him a measured look. Are you worried that I may be leading us down a less than virtuous path, Anomen?
No, never. But that does not mean that you do not struggle to keep your course. No, it does not,
she conceded with smile.
But be assured, Anomen, there is no struggle. I do as my heart directs, and you, yourself, have seen the results. Yes, I have,
he agreed dully, the weight on his heart back and heavier than ever. but Fritha did not seem to notice the change in him, the girl merely laughing brightly.
You sound disappointed, Anomen. Were you hoping to be the instrument of my redemption, saving me from the dark thrall of my blood? Yes, I imagine that would sound pretty impressive, especially to certain people. No, you misunderstand me,
he continued hastily, desperate to explain when a sharp knocking cut him off, the door opening without invitation to reveal the smiling form of the druid.
Fritha, oh, good morning, Anomen,
Jaheira greeted politely, before turning her attention back to the girl.
Are you finished in here, Fritha? Everyone else is already downstairs. I've just got to pack my bag. Anomen's ready though, aren't you? Well,
He looked from Fritha to the expectant face of Jaheira and nodded once.
I shall come now.
After a quick breakfast, where for once it was Ari who was refusing to partake, the group left the inn with plans to replenish their supplies and sell on some of what they had won from the bandits. But it was a task that was to prove impossible, the famous stall-lined streets of Trade Meat hardly any busier than they had been the previous night.
Goodness, it's so quiet,
murmured Ari, the stillness of the place creeping into them as well, it seemed, as she glanced up and down yet another empty street, the damp breeze billowing about them.
Do you imagine the animal attacks are to blame?
Fritha shrugged.
I don't know. Look, there's someone.
The group turned to follow her hand as she pointed down to the end of the long cobbled street where an elderly man in dark green robes was stood beside a table under a deep canvas canopy. He was hunched over sorting through his wares, though he glanced up at their approach, stepping forward to greet them, and Fritha was delighted to see the stall was covered in neat stacks of books in all sizes, sorts, and conditions.
Good day to you travelers, I bid you welcome to my humble stall. Were you looking for anything in particular, or have you some rare volume for sale perchance? Neither, to be honest,
admitted Fritha apologetically.
We've goods for sale, but mostly weapons and jewelry, and, as you can see, we haven't had much luck so far. I must admit this isn't what I expected from the merchant haven of Trade Meat, even for all the animal attacks.
The man's face fell, his woolly eyebrows brought low in a frown.
Ah, my lady, if those deceitful druids were our only problems, then it has been proved that they are indeed the instigators of these attacks.
Interrupted Jaheira sternly, the merchant sending her a suspicious look.
Why, yes, madam. There have been reports that during the last few attacks, men recognizable from the grove were directing the violence. In fact, there are even rumors that one was captured during yesterday's raid and is being interrogated by the High Merchant even now, though that is just hearsay.
Minsk shook his great bald head gravely.
No, this is not good. Who says druids should be protecting animals, not making them fight? Indeed,
agreed Jaheira in a measured tone,
and peace had lasted for so long between the grove and the town, I find it difficult to believe the druids would break it without cause.
So, Fritha interjected quickly at sight of the merchant's affronted look,
what is this other trouble that has befallen the town then?
The man turned his attention back to her and shook his head sadly.
A short time after the attacks began, Trade Meat suffered yet another blow. A group of jinn made camp outside the walls and quickly set about buying all that the caravans passing through our town had to offer. They bought at prices higher than our traders could afford. You see no merchants about you, my lady, simply because they have nothing to sell. I am unaffected, as you can see. I do not rely on the caravan for my wares. But many do, and now most caravans bypass Trade Meat entirely because of the attacks. We have no hope of ending this crisis. In fact, the last few caravans to pass through our town are still trapped here, unwilling to risk the forests with those druids still abroad. They're camped on the small plain on the east side of the town along with those Kalimshite troublemakers. But the High Merchant, Lord Coprith, will have more news on this than I. Please visit the town hall if you wish to know more.
Frithha nodded and smiled.
Fair enough, though we were hoping to stock up our supplies first. I don't suppose you know of anywhere suitable open, do you? I fear not, my lady. Everyone I know is keeping what provisions they have for their families rather than attempting to sell them, for who knows how long this standoff will last. But please take a moment to browse my wares. They're mostly local history and those stories of a more romantic sort that are so popular with young ladies at the moment. But there are some volumes of arcane lore towards the back and you may find something to your tastes.
Frithha nodded politely, unsure whether or not she should be insulted that he didn't think she would be interested in books of a romantic sort. He merely smiled hopefully though as another customer arrived behind them.
Ah, please excuse me.
Frithha instantly turned her attention to the table before her, rifling through the piles of books eager to see what he had. Nalya, Jahara and Ari joining her though less enthusiastically, the men moving to stand at the edge of the stall and talking idly amongst themselves, clearly not expecting to find anything of interest to them.
Anything of use?
Asked Ari, returning to the table a heavy worn book that was written in symbols she now recognized as Old Draconic. Frithha looked up from the small slim volume she held, an ornate scrollwork of hearts and turtle doves on the cover.
Oh, maybe,
she answered, glancing down to a couple of old tomes she had pulled from the jumble, a grin lighting her face as she went back to the book in her hands.
But by Millel, some of these novels are awful. Listen, and he kissed her, the kiss of forbidden desire. Frithha!
Ari scolded playfully as Frithha and Nalya laughed, the elf unable to admonish further as Nalya cut her off. Oh, I've found a good one.
She looked upon him, his virility strangely compelling even as it frightened her.
Frithha snorted noisily into the book she held, Ari hiding her face in her sleeve as she shook with laughter, and even the druid's lips were twitching.
That's dreadful!
Cried Frithha, still giggling as she dabbed her nose on her sleeve.
What's your one like, Jahara?
The druid glanced up sharply, a color creeping slowly into her cheeks as she threw the book back onto the pile.
Nothing of any interest to young girls such as you.
The three girls laughed raucously, the noise of them drawing an interested glance from the merchant, though he remained with his other customer.
Well, I've chosen,
announced Frithha finally, straightening to scoop a small pile of books into her arms.
There's a couple of volumes on Arcane Theory that look quite interesting. Arcane Theory,
confirmed Jahara dryly, taking the topmost book from the pile in her arms to glance it over, a fine woodcut of a decidedly soppy woman gazing up at a full moon on the cover.
Ardor by moonlight.
But Frithha just grinned with unashamed glee.
Come on Jahara, look at the cover, you just know it's going to be hilarious.
The druid laughed and shook her head as Frithha continued to the girls behind her.
Do either of you want any?
They did, and in the end Frithha carried quite an armful over to the now delighted merchant, Frithha trading them for a couple of bloodstones and a bracelet of glass beads that had little monetary value, though he said he could give them to his granddaughter as a present. With the rest of the market seemingly deserted, there was little point in lingering there and Frithha led them back along the street, turning to cross the empty square to the town hall. A grand building of granite and blue slate, it ran the length of the whole east side of the main plaza, the huge temple to Joaquin opposite it, while a large ornate fountain stood at the square's center, the soft patter of the water echoing eerily about them. Inside, it was no less grand, nor was it much busier. A guard approaching to ask their business there and moments later the group was stood before a huge polished desk in a richly furnished study, the High Merchant, Lord Coprith on his feet as he welcomed them in. The introductions were hearteningly brief. It seemed Coprith had already heard of their group and was more than happy to accept the services of the ones who had enjoyed such success in Im's Vale, the man settling back in his chair and gesturing for them to take the extra seats the servants had brought, before he began his tale.
Well, I am glad to tell you all I know of the matter, and though that is not much, there have been some developments since the plea for assistance was first sent out. The creatures of the surrounding forests have been attacking caravans and sometimes even trade meat itself for over a 10-day now. The druids of the local grove were always suspected to be the source of the violence, but during these last few attacks this rumor has finally been confirmed, and yesterday I believed we had made another breakthrough, though I have since discovered I was mistaken. Are you speaking of the druid you've taken prisoner?
Asked Jahara abruptly. Lord Coprith gave a wry smile.
Ah, I see, it is true, nothing travels faster than idle rumor. I should have known it would be impossible to keep such news quiet, though I tried anyway. I was worried that should the townsfolk find we've a druid held here, they would storm the hall and demand I hand him over. He was discovered by a group of people in the town yesterday, shortly after an attack on the north gates. They instantly assumed he was with the other aggressors and he was set upon most brutally.
Coprith shook his head solemnly.
If it were not for the guards intervening, I fear they might have killed him. He was brought here, but after speaking with him I soon came to the conclusion that he was not allied to the grove, and it was as he maintained, that he himself had been sent to investigate the conflict. But I could not release him to his task, not with attitudes towards the druids being as they are, and if I am caught having him escorted from the town I risk being labelled an accomplice.
Fritha nodded sympathetically. He really was stuck.
Yes, and we have heard that this conflict is not the only trouble trade meat is facing now. You refer to those blasted jinn?
Coprith confirmed crossly, running a hand through his greying hair.
They arrive out of the blue and demand I send men out into the forest to find some beast for them. I tried to explain that all hands were needed here protecting the town from the druids, but they would not listen, and now they've taken over the town's trade. When this conflict with the druids is ended I shall have to help, if only to get rid of them, but until then my hands are tied. About this conflict,
pressed Jahara, giving the man a stern look as she continued,
can you think of no reason why the druids would suddenly break the peace?
Coprith sighed again, though tiredly this time, a faint smile pulling at his mouth.
Cerned, the druid we arrested yesterday, asked me exactly the same question. I looked into this matter long before you or he arrived, spoke with merchants and guildsmen alike, and know of no reason for the attacks. But I believe now I may have a solution to them. I have a proposition for you, if you will hear it.
Cern shifted stiffly on the hard wooden bench, every movement sending dull pains through his entire body, though he ignored them for the most part, leaning back against the wall behind him, the cold stone soothing the aches in his back. The priests from the temple of Joaquin had tended to the worst of his wounds the previous day, and all that remained were bruises, painful but nothing serious. Quite fortunate for a man who had been so violently set about, he considered, trying to improve his mood as he glanced around the gloomy cellar kitchens of the town hall. The room was illuminated only by the light from the hearth, the coals that glowed in within throwing a dark orange light over the pallet that had been placed on the floor before it, the blankets still rumpled from where he had risen that morning. It was a large room and, though there were no windows, quite airy, but even so he felt claustrophobic. Though he had agreed with Coprith, in that it would be too dangerous for him to attempt to leave the town at that time, and was grateful to the man for arranging him somewhere out of the way to stay while the storm passed, Cern could not help but long to be outside, under the sky once more. The idea that he was unable to do to his own foolishness making it all the harder to bear. The door was not locked, but he still felt like a prisoner, trapped by the people's hatred and his own clumsy appearance in the town. He had been so eager to find the source of the trouble, he should have been more careful, and now he was reaping the consequences of his rashness. Fury at himself swelled, but with a practiced ease he quelled it, letting the feeling subside into the unruffled calm that usually hung about his heart. Such anger would help no one, least of all him. His rashness had already been the cause of one setback in this, he should. Cern stopped this line of thought as he heard voices echoing along the corridor outside. A young woman was talking and he wondered if it was one of the guild mistresses come with Coprith to question him further, her voice muffled but audible through the wood of the door.
And gods, Jaheira, did you have to be so accusatory? I know you want proof the druids are truly to blame in all this, but there's hardly any need to take every word said against them as a personal insult.
Another voice, again female though this one sounded older, her accent placing her as one from the Tathirian regions.
I am merely looking for the truth in the matter and my methods are no concern of. Here we, the last door, just as Coprith said,
cut in yet another girl, and Cern wondered just who was outside, though he was given no more time to contemplate this as the door opened and a girl entered, quickly scanning the room to find him.
Hello, Cern, isn't it?
She greeted, moving into the room proper, and he could see now she was of an elven heritage, the pale copper curls that had escaped her hairpins almost hiding the slight point to her ears. Cern said nothing at first, watching as the two other voices gained forms, two more women entering the room behind her, the first, another half-elf, tall and tawny, the other, a full elf and much shorter with it, her golden hair bound back from her face, sharply pointed ears peeking through the wavy tresses.
Well met to you, ladies,
he greeted finally, when sure no one else would be joining them.
I am Cern, as you say, though my identity is surely no secret after the fuss I have caused here. If it were not for the actions of Lord Coprith, I doubt I would still be alive.
The red-haired girl smiled.
Yes, well, he clearly thinks a lot of you. He has told us of your investigation into the conflict here and has asked us to accompany you from the city and aid you in the task.
And from there she introduced their three to him, explaining how the rest of their group upstairs awaiting them, the girl brightly rattling off their names and plans. Cern smiled, feeling as though something was at last working to his advantage.
Ah, finally some thaw to this bitter deadlock,
he sighed, making to stand.
You would leave now? I am more than eager to leave this place.
Fritha glanced to the Tathirian women he now knew as Jaheira with a shrug.
Yes, I suppose there is no reason to linger here if we can't trade. Are you well enough to travel?
Asked the elf, Ari, starting towards him with a tentative hand held out as though to check the dark welt that he knew still stained the side of his jaw. He smiled reassuringly at her.
It is much worse than it looks, child. Good,
continued Jaheira briskly,
and you have a cloak?
He nodded, moving to retrieve it from the pallet before them, where it lay discarded next to his bag, and Fritha sent him a grin.
Best if the townsfolk don't see you, eh?
Outside, it was trying to rain again, the first time yet the poor weather had been a benefit, Cern able to pull the hood of his cloak up over his face without looking suspicious. The streets were slightly busier now the morning was half gone, the people they passed sending them dark distrustful looks as they made their way eastwards through the town. Until, finally they reached the town walls, passing through the gates with a nod to the guards to find themselves out on a grassy clearing about 200 yards across, a myriad of tents and carts huddled against the walls, as far as possible from the forest that surrounded them. A clear path had been left from the gates to the forest's edge and, without a pause, the group set off. Fritha was walking almost abreast with Jaheira and the newcomer, and she took the chance to look at Cern in the daylight. She could not see much of his face, though this was probably a good thing considering the situation, and her mind drifted back to the gloom of the kitchens. He had strong if slightly weathered features, which made him appear older than Fritha suspected he actually was. She had wondered how the townsfolk had known Cerned was a druid to attack him, not just some stranger or with the caravans, though she was left in little doubt once she had met him. If anyone could look like a druid, it was Cerned. His hair, an ash blonde so pale that it was almost grey, was worn long and entwined here and there with rough stone beads and fragments of wood. His clothes were simple and travel-worn, the staff he held similar to Jahara's though much less worked, the long pole twisted and gnarled as though it had not changed much since it had been taken from the tree.
"So how did you come to be here, Cerned?"
asked Jahara after a moment, pointedly ignoring Fritha's surprised look. It was unlike the woman to ever instigate small talk.
"We know you were drawn by the conflict between the townsfolk and the local grove, but more than that."
A paused to look at the woman addressing him, and Cerned made his reply. He had not spoken much up to this point, and Fritha found his voice had a calming quality, slow and mellow in a way that made her think of owls.
"At present, I serve the Grand Druid in the north. When he discovered that the Druid order of this region had severed ties with the traditional hierarchy, he believed I would be the best person to investigate the matter. But I have failed to learn anything so far. I was taken prisoner the instant I arrived, though I cannot blame the townsfolk. I appeared not long after another animal attack, so it must have seemed suspicious. I should have crept quietly as the vine instead of blustering as the wind. On occasion I sometimes forget the subtleties that allow nature to progress."
Fritha caught Jahara's eye, trying not to smile as she raised her eyebrows, and the woman frowned, turning instantly back to the man at her side.
"And have you any thoughts as to why they have broken contact with the hierarchy?" "I suspect a change of leadership, and the tales of violence I have heard since merely confirm this theory. If they are indeed without cause, then every step must be taken to end the attacks." "If they are without cause,"
repeated Fritha, emphasizing the slight stress he himself had placed on the sentence.
"You doubt Lord Copperth's word? It would not be the first time a leader has been blind to the transgressions of his people. One wolf may lead the pack, but each animal has its own will. If we find that the townsfolk have perhaps been felling trees or trapping—"
He trailed off and Anomen frowned.
"So if you find the druids have a cause, what then? You will allow them to continue with this violence?" "No," came Ari earnestly, "surely some agreement would be reached between the druids and the town."
She looked to the two druids for confirmation of this and Cerned paused a moment before continuing evasively,
"We must determine what is best for nature." "And what of the people of Trade Meat?"
questioned Nalia sharply, Jahara turning to snap a reply, and Fritha intervened hastily.
Now, children, we're too far away from a resolution to be arguing about it already."
The tense silence of a truce descended, Ari glancing northwards into the jumble of caravans.
"Hey, what is that?"
Everyone stopped to listen, the faint strains of music drifting about them in the cool air, hand chimes, a drum, a pipe, and an almost metallic thrumming she recognized as a sitar joined in harmony, and Fritha smiled.
"Ah, I think we've found our djinn."
They followed the Kalamshite music through the makeshift camp, passing the occasional trader or caravan driver, though no one questioned their passage, Fritha singing the words softly under her breath as they went. They had reached the source by now, a huge striped pavilion in violet and blue set against the forest's edge, without any worry as to the danger, it seemed, Fritha sweeping up with a grin to stand before it and raise her voice, her song floating over the damp autumn air.
"Oh, Eli Liadil, oh, Hamaradil, Hadil Lekar Muliko Na Belana."
A sudden silence as the music within stopped, and but moments later the tent flap was thrown wide and out stepped a tall swarthy man with a bald head and neatly cropped beard that came to a long point. His trousers and tunic were both of voluminous white silk, the width of the shirt kept in check by the long emerald green waistcoat he wore over the top, the thick gold embroidery that covered it glinting in the weak sunlight. He made for an impressive sight, his features lit with an entertained surprise as he surveyed the group before him, his eyes finally coming to rest on her.
What is this? A songbird has come to visit us? Well, greetings to you then, little Manali. I am Khan Zava of Kalam Sham, what can we Jinn be doing for you?
Fritha smiled, he radiated a loud amiability that reminded her of Minsk.
Well, we've heard something of your exploits about the town and we wished to ask you about it.
Khan stroked his beard ponderously.
Indeed, mortal? Well, I know not what you have already heard of this, so I shall commence at the beginning of the tale. We are in pursuit of a criminal of some repute, a Rakshasa, you have heard of them, yes? Creatures that look as tigers and walk as men. This one goes by the name of Itafir. A very naughty little creature, she and her two brothers have been causing all sorts of trouble in Kalam Shan. We have followed this particular prey for some months now, but she has eluded us at every turn. We know that she is hiding in this area in mortal form. You mean they are here in trade meet?
Exclaimed Nalya, looking alarmed, but the Jinn merely laughed grimly.
No, even she is not arrogant enough to hide so close to us. But she is somewhere nearby, of that we are sure. So you've taken over the trade of this town to force them to find her for you?
Confirmed Jahara, her contempt for this action quite evident, though Khan took no offense, the huge man shrugging evenly.
Well, what would you do, mortal? She is not foolish enough to reveal herself to us and we grow tired of the chase. It cannot be denied the hunt is certainly more enjoyable this way, yes.
He laughed amiably, seemingly unrepentant for the trouble he and his companions were causing.
In the beginning, we bought all goods from the caravans that passed through here and offered them for sale at prices too high for the merchants of the town, effectively cutting off their supply until they agreed to help us. Though now the attacks by the Druids are worse, no new caravans come anyway and our threats are idle. Well,
continued Fritha quickly as she felt the displeasure of those about her rise a notch,
we're going over to the Druid Grove now to see if we can't resolve one of these problems. We'll keep an eye out for this Rakshasa as well if you like.
Khan smiled broadly.
Yes, this would be a very good thing indeed, little Manali. Amusing though this is, we wish to return to Ari!
Cried a high voice behind them and all turned to see a young boy, dark-haired and skinny, his short cloak flapping out behind him as he tore across the wet grass towards them, his face glowing.
Nalya! Ari!
The two girls shared an astounded look, Ari turning back to cry,
Dalan!
The boy didn't reply, just barreled into her and threw his arms about her waist with such force it knocked her back a step, much to the amusement of the others.
My dove, should I be jealous?
Quipped Herr Dallas, his dark eyes shining.
Oh, go to!
Ari scolded, turning her attentions back to the young boy who had already released her to turn and embrace Nalya's legs, the red-haired girl giving Dalan a bewildered look and patting him awkwardly on the head.
Dalan, what onto real are you doing here?
The boy stepped back to send them both a wide smile.
Well, you put my brother and me on Fald's caravan back in Athkatla, didn't you? Well, he came here to sell his wares before taking us to Umar, but when we tried to leave we were attacked by animals and druids and everything. We fought them off, but had to turn back and we've been stuck here ever since. Fald's been in a temper for a 10-day, but I don't mind, it's really exciting.
Here he snuck a glance at Khan, his boyish awe evident, the Jinn sending him a friendly grin.
And we heard you saved Umar, we were so happy. Ah, that is good. And this must be your brother.
smiled Nalia as another boy approached them, the family resemblance plain to see.
Hello, Blael, m'lady,
he supplied politely, dipping a quick bow. On closer look, Fritha placed the youth at about 15 winters, much younger than his grave manner would suggest, though she expected having sole guardianship of a younger brother would make an adult of anyone.
I am glad we have had the luck to meet you both again. I was never given the chance to thank you for helping us before. Oh, well, you're quite welcome,
beamed Ari, going pink.
And these must be your companions,
Blael continued with a smile, turning to the rest of them.
I cannot say how glad my brother and I were to hear of our village's rescue. We and, indeed, the whole of Umar are in your debt. Hey Fald, look who it is!
Called Dalan as a short sandy-haired man of middle years appeared from one of the tents opposite, Fald glancing over to them at this address and frowning as he noticed Khan, though he ambled over all the same.
We meet again, ladies,
he greeted with a smile,
though I fear you find us in an even worse predicament than the first time we met. The boys have told you the details of it, I assume? At this rate I'll be lucky to finish my route and get back to the city before midwinter, and the poor townsfolk here are hardly better off, being forced out of business as they are.
He added audibly, with a look to Khan as though daring him to say something. The Jinn remained silent though, and Fald turned back to rest of them with a frown as he explained.
All were eager when we first arrived to sell on our goods and leave before the Druids escalated things, and the Jinn had a seemingly endless supply of coin. I regret to say I sold all my wares to them, not knowing their plans for the town. You tricked us, Khan.
The Jinn nodded evenly.
Perhaps so, but it is the Druids that keep you here, you cannot blame us for that, mortal.
But that certainly didn't stop Fald from wanting to, it seemed, the merchant glaring up at the man who stood over a head above him. Jahara cut in before anything more could be said.
Yes, and we had better be leaving if we intend to make any headway on either problem.
Fald nodded once, turning back to them with a polite, if strained, smile.
Indeed, take care all of you. Yes,
agreed Khan, beaming once more.
Good hunting, little Manali.
And the group set off again, Dalan walking with them into the edge of the forest until an uncharacteristically stern Ares sent him back to the camp, Minsk using this moment of pause to consult Fritha's hastily amended map. The newcomer Cerned pushed back his hood for the first time since they left the dungeon, the man more at peace than Fritha had seen him yet as he let the fine rain mist his face.
Come, friends,
he said at last, adjusting his grip on his staff and moving purposefully to the head of the group.
The grove is this way.
Minsk threw a glance to the rest of them and shrugged, pushing the map back into his bag and ambling after him, and in silence they followed. End of chapter.